Welcome everyone. Welcome to this. I think this is the 10th event in forced migration in the arts, which is an online series that brings together people with lived experience of forced migration, and also artists, academics, and activists for conversations exploring related issues. For tonight's event, we have got two speakers. We've got Sarojani Lewis, who has a background in fine art with specialization in archival photography, video art, and book arts. She's currently working as a curator, researcher, and artist, a PhD in visual studies, examined the indentured labor archive through a contemporary lens, and her projects review a preoccupation with the history of landscape, the city, the environment, and its user. She questions what unites people, in particular their cultural diversity, what kinds of views are present. Recurring elements in a visual research are photographs of objects, people, migration, and moments that reveal forgotten situations and function as visual traces and fragments that create narratives which lead to new perspectives. And our second speaker is Brahma Prakash, who is an assistant professor of theater and performance studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. Prakash has worked on forced migration and the arts in relation to the Caribbean migration from Bhojpuri and Magahi regions of India. The region still remains a location of laborers who migrate to different parts of Indian cities and states. They have a repository of rich song and theater traditions known as Bidesia, which can be translated as theater of migrant laborers or of people who have gone to foreign lands. So without more from me or on that introductory note, I hand over to our two speakers. And our first question maybe is if you could tell me how the work started and also what you're doing, how you're doing it, and where.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing me this platform and giving me this opportunity to share some of the works that we both have been I and Sarojani Lewis have been doing for some time. Yes, of course we have two sides. I generally work on culture, mostly on song culture from Bhojpuri and Magahi regions, and I am in the native countries. Yeah, for example, what is happening in the native land, migration happened. The similar aspects. Yeah, so yeah, it all started because huge migration, and as you said, that was hello. Yeah, Bruce, am I audible?
The connection is not very good. It's breaking.
Yeah, so maybe may I to go in the meantime, and I will try to see the connection if it can get better.
Okay. Okay. So maybe while you are doing that, we go to Sarojani.
Okay, thank you, Amrose, also for inviting me here. Um, I was also studying, I just finished my PhD at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. I just did my Viva in March, so I just recently finished, and my co-supervisor was Brahma Prakash, Professor Brahma Prakash. So yeah, it's very nice to be in this platform together, and I think I have studied the visual side of the indentured labor, also from the Bhojpuri and Magahi region from India, so the same region. And I've been really looking at the archival photographs of the indentured laborers, as well as the contemporary art of the diaspora. Yeah, I've looked in particularly at Suriname, where my mother is from. So I've had a bigger interest in Suriname in South America, because of all the family members that are living there. And I also did some field work in Mauritius. So my focus was mainly in Suriname and Mauritius mainly. And yeah, I think my interest started also as an artist. So I really come from an artist background. I did art school, and I started with documentary photography. And yeah, I think from the practice, I started developing some artistic ideas, and also through my mother. She's also a poet, and she wrote poems on the Sarnami, which is the language from Suriname, from this diaspora. And through this connection, I kind of started to take interest in this contemporary art of also other artists, as well as the oral history combined with the archival photographs. And I've been developing a methodology for this, which Professor Prakash also helped me a lot to think about how to navigate between contemporary art and the present and the past. So yeah, I think that I can elaborate later, or I don't know if Sir wants to continue.
Yeah, so hope I am audible now. Hope the connection is better.
Yeah,
it
I
is.
think so.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so this all started with the kinds of region that I come from, that whole cultural geographical regions, and because it is migration is of almost every household, where like people go to migrate to different cities in India, to Kolkata, Mumbai, and of course we are also discussing about this colonial migration or post-migration that happened during the colonial period, in which people migrated to different parts of the Caribbean countries. That is the parts like more Sarojani after, but I'm more interested in that what happened to that whole migrant communities who were left behind, how they are situation now, because migration, or one can say very economic or forced migration, still remains that paramount condition in which they are working and migrating. So one that I'm trying to see the trajectory, how the continuity of those trajectory and what happened to those migrant communities. And we have seen this crisis again during the COVID-19 period, when migrant laborers from different parts of North India, especially from Bihar, they got stuck in all the major cities, and it really caused very different kinds of scenario in which we have seen that whole migrant exodus that has happened, that they just wanted to go back to home, they just wanted to return back to home. So I'm also more interested in, more than economic kinds of situation, I'm also more interested in this whole psychological, cultural kinds of aspect in migrants participate and in which they work. And that was the situation. So this both the kinds of, like, that one that has come in my previous book, where I'm trying to think about whole traditional sense of these migrant communities, like what has been the kinds of genre they have been participating on, and how a song becomes one of the major genre in which they express and articulate their views. And especially if you're thinking about, because this migration was very specific in Indian context, because largely you have huge participation of the lower section or lower caste that we call in India, so lower caste sections, and especially also you see the migration of the women that was also happening in a very forceful situation. So then I'm trying to look into this trajectory to what is happening even in contemporary time, what has happened after the Caribbean migration, and that continuity that I am interested in. But yeah, I'm more interested in this whole performative or performance culture around migration. And perhaps that is the dialogue we both can have here. I can have with Sarojani, who is doing very interesting work from more visual culture around visual aspects of these migrations. So I think, yeah, so I will stop, and after that we can come back again.
Yeah, thank you. And then maybe before we look at the performance cultures or visual cultures, we look at migration itself, migration in the Indian context. I don't know, what have you found in your research? Where did people who moved from India, where did they go, both in the colonial period and also currently? Where did they go, and what compelled them to go there, and in what way can that movement be described as forced migration?
Yeah, Sarojani, would you like to go first, because
Okay, what do
seeing
you
those aspects, so I
prefer?
think you can go first.
Okay. I think my mother is born in Paramaribo, which is the city in Suriname. And as far as I have researched, the laborers left from Calcutta, the port of Calcutta, to Suriname by boat in a 3-month journey. And they arrived in Suriname between 1873 and 1920. And I think that many boats came to Suriname, as well as Guyana, French, British, Trinidad, Jamaica, and all of the Caribbean countries. And what I was very important of this, or at least what I found important in the research I've done, is that the female perspective of these migrants was for me quite interesting, because there were two main issues that I researched, which was the colonial, they had to replace the work of enslaved people. And secondly, the colonial figures that were doing the administration from the Dutch side were also repressing women, also often sleeping with them, and other kinds of things that happened on ground of the plantation ground. And then besides that, there was also the patriarchy from India. So you have their own husbands that were having some issues, or partners, because there was not an equal gender relation. So you had one woman for 3 men, and the men also want to get married. So what happened was that there were polygamous relationship, which caused certain amount of emotion of jealousy. So when some of the women had their nose chopped off or other body parts, and some others were empowered by their power to choose certain relationship with the husbands or partners. So there were also financial exchanges of jewelry through this process of gaining more wealth, because multiple men meant also multiple jewelry. So I think that on one hand there were victims from like colonial violence, as well as their own patriarch community from India that caused certain emotional disturbances. And I think throughout the generation, this kind of situations have not been discussed among generations. So intergenerational trauma is a very serious cause, or of this two forces that were at play. And throughout the research, I came to understand that it's very difficult for the current community to talk about traumatic events, and all of these things are silenced. So it's very clear that there's a deep psychological trauma of this diaspora at present. The highest number of suicides in the Netherlands is of this particular community. So I think that through these certain artworks, one can review something of these traumatic events, and as well as the empowerment of women, because I think that throughout the generations, they also gained a certain empowerment or independency, because there were also women who could do their schooling and their jobs. So, and the second migration from Suriname to the Netherlands, which meant that my mom could migrate to Netherlands when she was 18 years old and study journalism as well as Sanskrit. And so, it was then more economic perspective, of course, but doesn't mean that this, psychological trauma and what happened on the plantation ground has ever been, as such dealt with or spoken about. And some of the signs of this intergenerational trauma I can see in her poetic writing about this, as well as some glimpses of this in oral memories of my family members and other artworks of artists that I met throughout these studies. So this is my point I think I want to make.
So were the reasons why people went to, let's say, the Caribbean, were they the same as the reasons why people went to the Netherlands?
No, I don't think so. Suriname became independent in 1975. It is now somewhere like almost 40 years ago. But of course, this was very different, because first you have the replacement of slavery, by certain forced migration from India. Different factors, I think. And then secondly, the migration to Netherlands was more to do with the independent position and political an independency of Suriname in 1975, which caused for a lot of a second migration wave due to, of course, it was also labor, but I also think it was education. And yeah, I think it's a very different type of migration, perhaps.
And who were the colonizing powers in Suriname?
So it's the Dutch government from Netherlands, basically. So they were having a treaty with the British, colonizers at that time. And so there was this treaty of shipping the laborers.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about you, Brahma? In the research that you've been doing, who are the migrants, and what are or were their reasons for moving, and where did they go to?
Yeah, so of course, I would like to add what Sarojani was saying about very patriarchal situation in India, very feudal kinds of setup that also forced people to migrate, because that time, yeah, it was one that very forced migration that one can talk about, because Britishers wanted to have cheap laborers, and they were like forcing people to bring them there. But also the situation at home was not that great. Situation at home was very, very difficult for all, like many of the sections who migrated, and especially if you are thinking about the lower orders of the Indian society, caste society, and also for especially for women. So many times voluntarily wanted to migrate for different regions, and that is what we see later. First phase was more forceful migration, but later people to know that they are getting some jobs there, they are getting some kinds of recognition, because now the more archives are opening and they are also telling us very different kinds of a story. It's not always the forced migration that we talk about, but the situation at home was so difficult and so bad, and all because of many times because of the colonial, and therefore they were also migrating. So we should also need to, but what happens, what I realized that when I was doing my research, then I realized that when they tell this story, they will only talk about the post migration. They are not talking generally, if you're talking to the people who also voluntarily migrated because of the situation at home. They are largely talking about that how poor migration was really, really difficult, because now if you relate with the situation of the communities who migrated, of the community who remained this side, then still if you're talking about larger communities, then their situation has not improved much the way it has improved for the people who migrated to those countries, despite of all the pain, suffering, or situation that we can talk about. And this becomes a very paradoxical kinds of situation where kinds of mobility, economic kinds of mobility, but they are constantly harking back to this cultural kinds of sphere. They are talking about their landscape, lost landscape. They are talking about their lost culture, and that becomes a precisely point that generally songs creates a paradox, that it is talking about trauma, it is talking about suffering, but it does not talk about that much talk about that some kinds of mobility that has also happened through this migration. So that is one part. Second part is also about now the new archives are opening from both sides, and there, because when they were migrating from this land, this side, then this side were just thinking that how they were writing a lot of very emotive kinds of songs. They were doing whole emotive kinds of theater, and you had a person named Bhikhari Thakur. He created a new genre of theater. It is called Bidesia. So Bidesia becomes a larger trope in which everything was happening. So you have Bidesia becomes a genre in painting, Bidesia becomes genre of dance, Bidesia becomes genre of song, Bidesia becomes genre of theater. So many genre that time emerged. And emerged because migrant becomes a constant kinds of thinking, constant kinds of theme in which all the arts were getting mobilized around. But the problem with that region is that still you have this region has the kinds of specific geographical location in which migration was always there. So they were earlier, they used to migrate from different cities, they used to migrate to different other states in India. But then during the time, it was like a larger migrations happened of that youth, largely the youth. And because that whole section, new generation, the youths who were in there that time, maybe around 18 or between 24 years of age. So a huge section of those youths, they migrated, and therefore community really felt that trauma, because you have like a whole absence of the youth that they were not able to take up. And therefore you see that how that was creating a certain kinds of rupture in the cultural sphere, but also in a different kinds of a sphere that still people talk about as a part of some history or part of some kinds of very brutal kinds of memory. So that has become a constant memory. So what I will do, that I will just read out 1-2 songs, because this is also research on songs. So, and songs will give you this whole idea that how migration remains a constant thing. So even if they're writing very popular songs, then somewhere migration comes. So you cannot largely, if you are talking about the song culture from that region, so either they are singing erotic songs, either they are singing devotional songs, popular songs, migration constantly comes and become part of those songs. So you cannot think about songs without the question of migration. And that is why I think that region becomes very, very specific in India. And that also connect us to very economical factors that mobilize these kinds of migration. And so you have very popular song. And when I was doing my fieldwork in 2010, then I recorded these songs, and it goes like this: "Oh beloved, Holy Diwali has come." Festival Holy Diwali are very popular festivals in India. So, "Oh beloved, the festival has come. Buy a red dupatta and bindi and come. Even if you cannot buy, do come. Take the fastest train and come back." So then it's a very popular song. Many times they also creates whole erotic kinds of signatures. But what we find that the song is saying that whatever say, because the festival has come, we are missing you. So take the fastest train, whatever way you want to come back. We just want you. Even if you cannot buy gift for me, come back. And it goes on. So it again tells you that whole idea about the situation they are pushed into, and that continues. Same way, you have a lot of very beautiful songs about and one song goes about that how even if you're going to ask for a nose ring, that is a kind of ornament for women in this part. And so even if you're going to ask for the nose ring, then the male person has to migrate to Kolkata or to other parts, because the situation is so precarious, and that remains precarious for many migrant laborers. And other parts that I just wanted to tell you about this. So yeah, so both sides are now, and we can open up that archive from both sides. So one side was writing this song, and the song goes like: "At midnight, the nightingale calls, the pretty woman starts and stands near the bed. The mango has blossomed, the mahua tree has flowered, the sleep of the lady separated from her lover has broken, the breeze blows over her body. The door to memories began to open. The flowers has blossomed. The bee hovers near. Why has her beloved has not come home?" So this whole absence of beloved, that will be constant part of that things. And the thing was happening that earlier, even if you're thinking about the situation, then earlier this region also had a lot of devotional songs, spiritual songs, and then all the devotional figures were becoming migrant laborers. All the big devotional figures, deities themselves were becoming a migrant laborers, or migrant for that matter. Other parts that we can talk about, and that becomes very peculiar about that region, that you have metaphor for migration and death is the same. So if you are disappearing from the society, so then the metaphor is same, and therefore many times it becomes difficult to discern that whether the person is singing about death or whether the person is singing about migration. And this all tells about a very traumatic experience that community has gone through, because you don't have a clear separation between death and migration. So whoever has disappeared are not seen any longer. So people have that kind of assumption that maybe the person died, and that is what was happening during the Caribbean migration, because they were not sure about where they are going, whether they are going to come back or not, and it was taking months of time. So that was a very difficult migration that was taking. Yes, this was the one song from the native side, and I can pick up one song from other side that is now we are getting from archives from Caribbean countries, and this song goes like this.
Like the plane flies across the sky, like the plane flies across the skies, I will fly along with you, oh beloved. Beloved, I will come along with you, like the train runs along the tracks. I will run along with you, oh my beloved. So this also the dispersion, frustration, and that whole kinds of like traumatic kinds of experiences that we are going through earlier. This part of people were thinking because there were no that kinds, so we don't have that kinds of exchange that was happening. So this side was thinking that we are the people who are only missing them. We are the people who are only writing songs for them. But now we see that that sides were also writing a lot of songs, and that exchange was now happening at a emotive level without making that kinds of direct connections. Yeah, so this has been the kinds of thing, but the whole problem is that those migration still continues with whole new liberal kinds of economy, and that has also pushed many of these workers, migrant workers, in a very difficult situation. So yeah, situation many times in many factors have improved, but it has not improved if you're thinking in terms of gender question, patriarchal question, feudal question, that perhaps like got a very different kinds of mobility if you're talking about Caribbean migration or the migration who participated in second or third phase of migration. So I will stop it here for some time. Yeah.
Can I respond to this? Maybe? Can you hear me? I was just thinking that as a response to your poems, I like to read one poem from my mother.
Please, yeah, that's good.
Okay, so it's called My Country. I stand before you an empty-handed pauper, my wishes blown away by a cold, unwelcoming wind. Old promises are hurled in my face, like torn scabs from dried wounds. Guilt cloud my minds in darkness. I needed a prophecy to retrace my steps. When you suffocated me in your tight embrace, in a foreign country who rushed to rescue me, one single call made me lie down for ages. You knew it before time tightened the knot. How I used to creep the ground to gather abundance, full fragrance of your soil. Why did I came back to you when I have nothing to offer? This worn out love, an unquenchable thirst, I craved to touch the wallpaper of my mouth and rescue the child who was left behind. Yes, I did leave once in tremendous hurry. Why is it too late now to stand before you? That is written by Chitra Gayadin, who is my mother.
Yeah, and what does the poem say to you?
So poem talks about Suriname, and Suriname, I think she wants to, she wants to talk to her country in a way. So it's talking about certain intimacy that she feels to kind of retrace her steps in a way. But it's like a tight embrace in a foreign country, but it's something that's, I think for me, she talks about this estrangement as well as being pulled back in a way by memories. And she's saying it's too late to stand before you, because I think she's saying, I crave to touch the wallpaper of my youth and rescue the child who was left behind. So she's also talking about herself, how when she left herself in the country in a way, and so she cannot face herself in a way that feels connected, perhaps, or maybe this talking about this disconnection from herself, because in a way she left herself in the country where she was born in. So I think it talks about this.
Yeah, and then thinking about the visual cultures, when you were looking at the visual archives, what did you find? What did they tell you?
So yeah, of course, in my research, I went to different archives in the Netherlands, and I was struck by the way women were photographed as in studio portraits, very detached from the labor, and so it was very clear that there was some kind of exoticism going on about capturing, the ornaments or the nice sari or whatever the women were wearing. It seemed to be much more with an exoticized view, and not connected to the labor on the plantation. So I think that I'm kind of, was really disturbed in a way by this, because it seems that there was no connection anymore to the real poor conditions and labor that was done on the plantation.
And why do you think that was so? Why
I
why was
mean,
it?
the photographs were circulated and used in European countries as an advertisement to say we are doing a good job in the colonies. Look at these nice looking women, they are doing very well. So we are good. We are showing you what an incredible job we have done, right? They're even wearing jewelry. So great, beautiful decorative objects that we have there, basically.
Were there some among the photos that that didn't stick to that format, to that exoticization?
Yeah, of course. There are also more documentary approaches, and that is also evident in the Rijksmuseum collection that I've also discussed with Sir Brahma Prakash. Sir, he also discussed with me about a photograph where we saw like a Muslim family, and the woman being held tight by a man, as well as another man putting the hand on the head, and try to also look at these, meanings of the cultural meanings that are seen in these photographs, and whether, this means that they were, how much of agency these women really had, and to kind of discuss this by looking at visual traces.
Thank you. How about you, Bram? Thinking of Bidesia, who would you say is the primary audience for the songs, the dance, the theater performances?
Yeah, so you have, of course, it's about largely you have these migrant communities. They themselves are the major consumers of these performances, and they themselves are writing these songs. So that is the way you don't have now with the kinds of mediatization coming of the YouTube, different kinds of technology. You also have certain kinds of a small cultural industry that have developed around those songs. Otherwise, if you're thinking about the case like 15, even 15, 20 years back, then you have largely the songs were getting written by migrant laborers, and they themselves were the consumers, performers. So what will happen that generally they are working in different cities during the will come back and they will do their own performances. Many of them remain very, very popular. And because they are composing songs, music, and you have like a lot of like huge consumers of this song and music. And so I will say it is meant for the migrant communities, maybe who are staying at home, but many times the people who are also migrating and they themselves are listening their own kinds of songs and composing and constantly consuming. But I would just like to complicate some of those things, because one of the idea would be to think about how you're going to locate the question of native land and that destination that where they migrate. Because largely I'm thinking about the internal that also investment very forceful migration, because the situation at home is not that great. So they necessarily have to migrate to cities, or many times you are also migrating to many parts, like including Caribbean countries. But the problem with this migrant that if you're thinking in terms of identity, so they will call, like many times they will call Bidesia or Pardesi. Pardesi is generally the term is used for internal migration, and Bidesi used, like it's a very generic term that I'm saying. Bidesi is used for like international migration or Caribbean migration in that way. But when they go back to home, then even at home they're called Bidesi and Pardesi, and that becomes paradox. So when you are like outside, you are working in Delhi, working in Kolkata, or maybe in other parts, then also you are called Pardesi, that you have come from outside. But when they are going back to home, they themselves are called, they are getting called in outsiders. So this becomes a very paradoxical situation where they neither belong to home, nor belong to the cities, nor belong to those destinations, and they becomes outsiders. Same thing happens. So during the migrant crisis or during the COVID-19 crisis, that was the situation that was happening. Because if they were working in Delhi and Kolkata, then government there will say that, these are the population who migrated from that part. So they are not other population. They are not the countable population, and they are not part of this like constituency for that matter. And but the same thing was happening at the home, because they will consider that these are the people who already migrated. So this also creating a lot of like paradoxes. And if you're thinking about their own location, then culturally they are still able to make some kinds of inclination towards home. But if you're thinking about the real paradoxical kinds of situation, then they neither belong to home nor belong to the destination. And that becomes the paradox in which we can think about very neoliberal and that kinds of migration that is happening in that region. And that has been the site of even of the Caribbean kinds of migration. So that has been one of the paradoxes that I have also highlighted in my new book. I call Dance of the Migrant Laborers, because they keep dancing. And this also raises the question of mobility and mobility and movement, because they're constantly on movement. Sometimes they are migrating from one village to going to another city, and another city, if they are losing the job, they are going to another city. So they are constantly in a movement. So they almost becomes a figure of dancer, in which we can talk about that how migrant laborers are becoming a cultural figure of the dancer. But the same figure becomes so this is the expected, these are the expected movement in which they have to leave the village, they have to migrate to the cities. But the same migrant workers, if they're making very disruptive kinds of movement, and that creates a lot of problems. So for example, during the COVID-19, they decided that they will go back to home. So government was saying that you don't move, you stay wherever you want, wherever you are working now. The situation there was not that great. They were not getting that kind of support. And therefore, and also because they had this very strong cultural belonging, and therefore they wanted to go back to home. And there was the whole idea that even if you want to die, then we will go back to home and die there. Even if this is a situation of death, then we would prefer to have death at the village, at their hometown. And but again, that also shows that how and then this movement created a lot of kinds of difficulty for government, and they were not taking this movement in a very positive way, because they were trying to stop them, but they were not stopping. But something I'm also interested in this whole question of migrant laborers and movement. What happens when the very assumed movement gets disrupted, when they start moving back on their own condition? And then we can argue, and this is the way I have argued, that how migrant laborers even do not own their own movement. They are always moving on somebody's desire, for somebody's economy, for for somebody else. So this very movement becomes a kind of paradox that we can also talk about. But I think for me, the larger crisis, if you're thinking about those migration from Bhojpuri, Magahi, and different regions, then the whole crisis is that neither native land is able to accept them, nor cities are able to accept them. They are neither getting accepted there, nor in terms of economic policies, nor in terms of certain kinds of very cultural kinds of belief or cultural kinds of assumption that we can talk about.
Mm. And then thinking of the performances themselves, where do they take place, and under what conditions? How are they organized? Who organizes them?
So when I'm talking about Bidesia, then Bidesia represents a very different kinds of a range of cultural genre that we can talk about, a range of artistic genre that we are talking about. So it represents theater and performance genre, song and music genre, now also YouTube and media genre, in which they are constantly consuming, constantly performing. So it is happening, of course, they're doing the live performances for the communities, among the communities. Many times they also now organize these kinds of events in the big cities. So these performances are also happening in Mumbai, in Kolkata, in different parts of that, like cities that you can talk about. So, and they are also now uploading on YouTube, different social media. So this has become a kind of different sites that we can talk about, but most popular still remains the live performances that happens during the festival, during the wedding time, because you have the very active sense of participants, active sense of the communities, and they exchange a lot of these ideas and things, and that we can talk about. Yeah. So this happening in a various format that we can talk about. So music, song, dance, theater, cinema is also becoming industry. Cinema is also becoming very popular among those migrant communities. So of course it is like Sarojani has also talked about photographs. Many new artists, contemporary artists, they are also working on like a Bidesia kinds of theme. So Bidesia becomes a theme, or the theme of many kinds of genres, artistic genre that we can talk about. And yeah, so but again, most popular still remain for me. And I will say for most of the community are songs, theater, and performances. These are the main most popular genre. They are still producing and they are still participating.
Hmm. And can you say something more about the popularity of the performances? How are you measuring this? And also, how are the performances being received? Do they get coverage in local newspapers? Do they get airplay on radio or TV, magazine coverage?
This remains another paradox or other problem that we can talk about, because most of these performers, and if you're talking about the communities largely who are participating in these performances, again coming from the lower sections, many times they are not just that educated. They don't have that kind of they are still not part of the university discourses. So these are the things that very recently they are now becoming part of the university discourses or these kinds of discourses. Otherwise, and also the problem is that many times they are also doing a lot of very erotic kinds of performances, or many times very problematic kinds of very patriarchal and sexist kinds of performances. And therefore they are seen as very low. So even they are doing so one that because these are the communities who are not educated, who does not have that kind of exposure, then therefore that becomes also the reason that they are seen as a low, uneducated. And but again, the layer gets also layered by this whole idea, because they are seeing a lot of vulgar, erotic kinds of performances. And this zone becomes a very libidinal zone that one of our co-researchers, Akshay Kumar, has used the term libidinal zone, like how this whole performances also happens in very libidinal erotic zone. And then many times this whole argument will be coming from the middle class or social elites that they are doing very vulgar kinds of performances, and therefore generally get discarded, because then how you are going to play in a very sanitized space of social radio or television, that is not suitable for that matter. So, but again, you can see those kinds of erotic performances maybe happening even in Bollywood or big industries, but that generally don't get questioned in the same way. But here, because of the certain kinds of community who does not have that kinds of social or cultural capital for that matter, and therefore it gets easily labeled. So it is not, I would not say that this is not the question. Of course, it is many times very problematic songs, but again, it will bring the questions of lot of migration. So migration becomes the theme, but again, you are seeing in a very different way, and therefore it becomes another kind of thing that how we are going to study these song performances from gender point of view, from caste point of view, from many times from class point of view. And all these becomes a very, like, I would say, complex kinds of category that we can talk about. But really, these songs and culture don't have that kinds of popular acceptances among social elites, among like within like in radio, in television. So hardly appear, even they have good themes or like more, I will say, progressive themes for that matter. So hardly they have appeared on these like very accepted kinds of platforms that we can talk about.
Right. And for people who are listening, if you've got questions for our two speakers, if you put them in the chat, we'll come back to you. We go to Sarojani. In your view, why photographs or the visual cultures that you've been looking at, why do they matter?
I think the photographs are something like evidence of the lives of these migrants, because in one way they are documented. So I don't have any, photographs of the first generation migrants of my ancestors. And all these photographs, they form an evidence of this community. Also, I have to say, when I was studying at Jawaharlal Nehru University, I could not find any photographs of this community in this time frame in India. So whether they have been photographically documented is questionable. Besides, I think that the photographs I was appointed to that were taken in India were mostly from the elite or Brahmanical kind of families. So I don't know, high caste, whether there is any photographical evidence of this agricultural community of UP and Bihar. As far as I know, I haven't found them, but there might be in private collections. So I'm also wondering, like, if this is possible evidence of this community in that time frame, or if there are also, maybe they have been captured for the British project of the people of India, but I don't know if, as such, they have been only categorized as caste or examples for certain castes. So I think that in a way, this also becomes a certain evidence photographically.
How about you, Bram? How Bidesia and the practices that are taking place around it, how are they being documented, and who is doing the documentation?
Yeah, so you have now a lot of documentations are happening. One that, of course, the Caribbean populations who migrated because they are looking back to, again, they have like a clear longing for their own land and things. So they have done some remarkable, I think, collections for that matter. And I know Sarojani family members, they are quite involved in these kinds of like a song collection, in photography collection, all those kinds of collections. Others that, like others, you also have that new generation, because India has also, for many years back now, you have like now affirmative actions in the universities and spaces, and now you also have some family, like some members from those migrant communities that are coming, and they necessarily try to bring those kinds of positionality that was not there earlier in the university spaces, and therefore they are becoming the new generation of the scholars, and they are also documenting a lot. And now with the kinds of new technology, that has become quite possible that you can document many of things, like with the kinds of videos, audios, all these kinds of possibility with the cheap kinds of technology. That has also, I think, has created the new kinds of scenario in which they are documenting more and more. And yes, that is one, two parts, but also we have now the whole social media, like kinds of YouTube, and also because these are the songs, I'm talking about the songs, I'm talking about some of those genres that we can talk about. And now you also have different kinds of technological platforms or social media platforms where you also participate. Not necessarily they are coming from academic background, but they are more interested, or maybe coming from journalistic background or coming from social activism background. They are also the people who are documenting a lot, and they are doing very interesting kinds of documentation. Those are coming. And I think many times this whole boundaries collapse because, yeah, of course, Sarojani is also working on these visual evidences, and I am doing more on a kinds of song and performance kinds of evidences. But you have many powerful songs that itself themselves becomes visual evidence. So if you're going through those, like listening, imagining those songs, then that provides a very powerful kinds of visual evidence. So how the person is to look like, what he is to wear, how the person is to walk. And that also becoming a very interesting kinds of idea where I think visual and these kinds of boundaries or genre boundaries are getting collapsed. Second, you also have like new contemporary artists who are again coming, not necessarily coming from those communities, but they are more sensitive to these issues. And I think especially this recent migrant crisis have created a lot of these kinds of very kinds of situation in which more scholars, artists, and like community members, they are documenting these kinds of scenario. And I see that maybe in the near future, we are going to get more active kinds of archives that will serve many of these purposes that we are talking about.
And is there anything more that needs to be done around this documentation and archiving, in your view? And this is for both of you.
That like one of the questions, one of the questions I'm facing is because many times we are thinking from that positionality of those subjects who are migrating, either from like within India, or who are migrating to like this like, international migration. Many times now the migration is not necessarily happening to Caribbean countries. You have huge migration that is also happening to Dubai and other Arab world. So there you have like whole workers or migrant laborers, because we necessarily need to make a very clear category, because you have like white collar kinds of migration. They're going to work in IT sectors and they're getting well paid, and all their situation is relatively much better than if you're thinking about the migrant laborers questions, because many times we collapse these boundaries and just call them migrants, and I think that is not enough. And therefore, when we are talking about migration, then we need to have a very clear view. If we are working in India, where migrant laborers questions are very different from general migration that is happening from India. Other questions that I think also Sarojani has paid a lot of attention to, that if you're talking about migration that has happened to American countries, like the white collar migration that is happening to Canada, that is happening to UK, or that has happened to like Australia and other parts of the world, or UK for that matter, then you will see that how they are still able to maintain very like that caste system or kinds of system, because they are largely the migration who are coming from the upper caste, from the social elites of India, and largely they remain Brahmin. If you're thinking about the caste society, then largely they are going from that caste section. But if you're thinking about Caribbean migration, then it was a more mixed kinds of population. Largely it was a lower caste section or lower classes section for that matter, they migrated. And I see that how they were able to break many kinds of boundaries, either under the compulsion, because the situation was like that, or maybe because they were not so rigid about their religious or culture, that kinds of like very traditional idea of either different kinds of like patriarchy or religion that we can talk about. Yeah, of course, like that situation was unfolding in a very different way, but both the communities are still very, very different. Yeah, so possibility, I can see some of the possibility that we can see that we are still waiting for a lot more archives to open, more stories to be told, more songs to be written. And I think once we will have a more dialogue with Caribbean population who migrated from this side, and these active participants who are coming from new generation, then there is a possibility that we can have a more dialogue and more interesting kinds of research that can come up. Second, yes, this is the one part. Second part, I would like to say that also migrations many times are tempting these communities. So one that we can talk about the post-migration, but other migration is also becoming, giving a new kinds of mobility, new kinds of aspiration. So how to think about this migration that is many times was happening because of very forceful displacement and things, but in the longer run created something very different for situation for the country. So if you're thinking about the Caribbean, for example, Sarojani family, the way they are reading this migration, they may be reading in that how they were forcefully migrated or were forced to migrate to other parts. But the way I would see from my location, that maybe it was very difficult at that time, but for longer run, that was a necessary migration that has happened, and it provided some kinds of mobility or some kinds of exposure to those communities who not necessarily are still getting that exposure in India. So not necessarily I'm seeing migration in a necessarily in very traumatic ways, but yes, if it comes to cultural sphere, then they are still reading in a very traumatic way. But if you're thinking in more in terms of educational access, some kinds of mobility, I think also migration is doing some interesting kinds of mobility that this class really needs or this community definitely needs. And therefore you have one intellectual or intellectual thinker from India. His name, I think you must be familiar with, or even not familiar. So his name is B.R. Ambedkar, and he always did a lot of emphasis on, he comes from earlier erstwhile untouchable communities, and his whole idea was that how this lower section and women necessarily have to migrate in India. Unless they are not going to migrate, their situation may not improve. So now more complex discourses around migration are coming, and therefore it is complicating our own position and our own understanding. And I think new discourses will definitely are coming in a very interesting way. Sorry for taking that long time. Yeah,
it's okay. How about you, Sarojani?
Yeah,
I was just thinking that in a way, when I was doing going through my academic resources, there's been written about caste and how the caste status have been sort of amended in the Caribbean territory and Suriname as such. But I don't think at present that the idea of caste has disappeared. And so if you look at the Netherlands in this generation, one can see that caste issue among diaspora, Indian diaspora in the Netherlands is still visible. So one could say that there are a lot of high positions still taken by caste-related names, and yeah, there's still the issue of caste happening within the you know 6 generations migrants of India in Netherlands, and I wonder if it's also a revival of caste issue due to the current politics in India that also talk about purity and certain ideas about religion. So I was asked by a friend whether it would be interesting to sort of start a new project on what are the traces of caste within Indo-Caribbean families in the Netherlands, and how they are maintaining certain hierarchy within their own community, and the people that sort of reach for higher positions within the country. So I was kind of surprised by this, because I was aware, but not so much aware, that these things are still an issue actually, even after 6 or 7 migrations from migrant generations, let's say, so from India. So I think the issue of caste is actually very interesting and still an issue in the current community in the Netherlands, I would say. So I wonder why caste among the current generation in Netherlands, where it's not an Indian society or as such, but the community within a Dutch society. So I wonder why the issue of caste is still very important for Indian diasporic families, and how they identify themselves also with certain ideas of being completely vegetarian or whatever, or if it's caste related, or if you're all those matters that are for example, all of my family members, most of them became vegetarian and quite religious, and I just wonder if this issue of appearing more Brahmanical to other people would be the issue, or having the current relationship to India and sort of not being aware of the right-wing politics makes them behave in certain way, let's say. So I'm trying to understand this as well.
So before I come back to both of you, I'll just ask, does anyone in the audience have a question, comment, anything they want to say? If you do, if you unmute, you can unmute and say what's on your mind. While we're waiting for people to find the unmute button, I'll start with you, Brahma. In Bidesia, do you see anything there that what is the discourse on caste in Bidesia? You're mute.
Yeah, so I would like to come back what Sarojani was indicating towards. I think it is new kinds of conservatism and right-wing kinds of. So I think also if you're thinking about the previous migration who migrated from Bhojpuri and Magahi region, they were connected to more local and that kinds of geographical regions in India. Now, if they are finding some kinds of connection, they are trying to find through the Indian national category, nation becomes a more an important category for them, and which they are definitely getting more mobilized towards this idea of the right-wing kinds of politics, becoming more Hindus. Not necessarily they were coming from that kinds of background, but now they're trying to become more Hindu, they are trying to become more Indian, and that way it is both nation and religion both are becoming kinds of category through which they are trying to find their own identity with India and with this kinds of identification. Yeah, of course, if you're talking about that native, what happened with the Bidesia native kinds of performance. So largely in India and in those sites, they largely remain from the lower caste. Still, they remain from the lower caste because you have very high caste migration that also happens. But if you're thinking about those cultural sphere are very much still remain very, very divided, in which you also have people coming from upper caste, but largely the cultural scenarios are still getting dominated by the lower caste section, and that becomes one of the reasons that they don't figure out in the very upper caste kinds of even decolonial and post-colonial discourses. So we'll find that of course, people who are providing this post-colonial, decolonial discourses. So they will talk about, again, they will talk about this idea of the native idea of those culture. But largely, if you're talking about those culture, they still remain absent even in these kinds of new discourses. And that creates a kinds of one of the kinds of problem that we can talk about. And yeah, so for your question, I would say that still if you're talking about the cultural scenario in this parts of Bhojpuri and Magahi region, the cultural sphere still belong to the lower section. And yeah, you have more upper caste section, they are participating, but their role remains quite limited in these kinds of cultural production, where you have questions related to migrant workers, migrant laborers. They are there, but they remain in very limited numbers. So there, that boundaries are very, very clear, very, very sharp, very, very distinctive. But I think maybe in diaspora population, it is happening the other way around. because if you're thinking about the situation maybe 40 years back, then that was not the scenario, but now they are getting more rigid about the food, the culture, this whole idea of the Indianness, and they are becoming more national than the earlier they used to belong to or make some kinds of identification with the regional categories. Now they are trying to make more identification with the national categories. And that creates another problem in which, like, they are getting mobilized around the right kinds of politics. Here, if you're talking about the larger section of the migrant workers, they still remain divided, how they vote, how they, like, even about the food habit, even about their clothes, kinds of, like, what they wear. So they remain very fragmented communities in that way. But if you're thinking about more like diasporic population now, then they are getting more rigid about all these things. And that is the kinds of differences that you can find out here.
How about you, sir?
Hope I have answered your question.
No, it's fine. How about you, Sarojani? In the archives that you've looked at, you mentioned that there is a disassociation between the images and the people's labor.
Yes.
What do you see happening around caste in the images?
Around caste?
Yeah.
So I think that the colonial projects that were undertaken for these, indentured labor destination colonies as such, you had very different projects. So, for example, the French in Mauritius would photograph almost most of the migrants and give them a number, and they would have their immigration record connected to that number and photograph. So it was very, very, very systematic, and the system was there, but which also means that from all the photographs that are taken from ancestors, a family can look up the specific person. And also the caste. So in Mauritius, I would say there's a very much detailed information about which caste, which region, etc., and which kind of appearance that belonged to that person, let's say, and their the place that they were that they came from, the community. And then in Suriname, it was not done like that at all. So there were just photographs in the studio, photographs where photographers had certain interest in taking the photographs at the depot where the migrants were residing for a certain amount of time. So one doesn't know anything about the caste, whether it's a Brahmin widow or Dalit caste. One does not know anything basically when you look at the photograph. But because it's not so systematic, I feel there's a much more documentary approach to the photographs that are not taken in the studio. So I think there's also an advantage of having this kind of lens that is not so systematic as the French, let's say. And so for the British project, I'm still not understanding what their, system exactly was, but I have to look into that a little bit further to understand how these systems would be different. But I know that the Dutch and the French way of, creating this photographic project and the different Dutch photographers, they all had very different approaches. And I think in the Caribbean, they again had different ideas of making money in the photo studios, and also if it was a government project. So there are very different motivations behind the visual information you can retrieve from the photograph, I think.
Mm.
And so I still would like to understand a more, British focus on the idea of capturing. But yeah, and then there are so many different British colonies that it's a large issue, I think.
I would just like to add one more point if we have time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Point.
Yeah. So yeah, just one point I would like to add. We did it's not very. I'm not making. It's we are getting some anecdote, or also it's provided by some documents, but again that cannot be generalized. Some of the figures that we are getting is that say that when Britishers at least were taking these migrants, because they knew the Indian society, they were quite aware about the caste society. And when they were free, because these migrant laborers were supposed to work in a sugarcane all this field and do this agricultural laborers, very hard labor. And they were quite sure that if you are bringing that upper caste, because they themselves in their own land, they don't participate in these kinds of hard work. And therefore they were more interested. The anecdote I'm based on this, so they were more interested in taking those lower caste people, because they were sure that how they are going to work in a manual labors and they can do it, the hard work. But that time also happened, we are also getting some evidences where they say that the people who are coming from the upper caste, but again from the lower class section, who were facing a lot of these economic situations, so they change their own names many times to migrate, or to go to work in the Caribbean countries. So there are many paradoxes or complexity that we can talk about. But if you're thinking about the British project, British were quite aware about this, very much aware about the caste system, and they were quite deliberate that who should go and who should not go, whom to pick up and whom not to pick up. And this was more or less systematic. Yeah, in terms of evidences, we don't have any systematic evidences, but in terms of selection, we can just imagine the selection that was happening, that what one is going to do and which work this community will not do. And these all were very much consideration when they were us forcing them to migrators. Yeah, so
and then
here. Yeah.
And then this is going to be my penultimate question. Zooming out a little bit, in your view, what do the arts bring to questions around forced migration? Why do the arts matter when we are thinking about forced migration? What can the arts do? What do they do? How do they help us think about forced migration?
So yeah, so I would agree with that, how art was always a kinds of providing some kinds of healing capacity, certain kinds of therapeutic kinds of connection for those communities, because they were always singing, they were always participating in music, they were always participating in festival. So they were very much knew that power of the art, or power of that kinds of cultural expressions. And therefore, even they were going on sea for almost 2-3 months, many times. It used to take long time. They used to sing while they're migrating, and that connection are still, I think, remain very, very strong, where they are constantly harking back to art, because art becomes that very it gives them a very existential kinds of connection. When you don't have anything, then you go back to song. When you don't have anything, go back to music. And that has been a kind of very powerful continuity that we can think about this migration. And I think this is the way I think art can still provide a healing capacity, or some kinds of therapeutic justice or cultural justice for those communities who lost either some connections, or still face very different kinds of difficulties in their own destination, either within India or outside of India. So I think art becomes the ultimate therapeutic kinds of connection they are still continuing with, and that is the resources we are very proud of, and that we still think that is the possibility.
How about you, Sarojani? You're mute. Sorry. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just thinking about the artist from Netherlands at the moment, and about the work, for example, of Surinamese artist Razia Barsati, who is an artist that is basically really working on the taboos of women. And I think when I look at her art, I can see many layers in that work. Like visual aspect is, for example, I'll show you this, oh, I don't see it now, but there's a very yellow, bright cloth we use for cleaning. And so this cloth appears in her work, and she draws on this cloth, or it appears in an installation on the ground, for example. So I was really thinking about that symbolic aspect of these cleaning cloths. That's also the obsession, for example, my aunties have with the cleaning the floor or house. Seems to be very obsessive cleaning. So I think that with her work, she's also speaking to the community in a way that, why is there this obsession with cleaning? Is it a mental status that some things are not clean, basically, and you can never really clean them, but as much as you can, you try to clean up the past, perhaps, but obsessively cleaning the house again and again. And what are these hidden layers of the psychological internal world of the women that is hidden, for over generations, and this obsession with cleaning, like sickening obsession that you think, okay, you can clean, but this is really excessive cleaning. So it's very interesting how you can sort of see these elements in the artistic world, and how she visually also, connects to this cloth, and it becomes a different world altogether.
Thank you. And this is my final question. Both of you, is there anything that you want to emphasize?
Yeah. Okay. So I think So yes, I think that still we are waiting for more archives to open, more these dialogues to open, and I think more exchanges, because if you're thinking about Caribbean migration, then we are also talking about different kinds of also African connections, or African kinds of that dialogue that has happened between these migrant communities and African communities, for that matter. Also this whole layers of the caste question, the race questions that we had not so much paid attention to. So for example, how this community maintains some kinds of relationship with communities from Africa, from communities from other parts of the world. And I think there are many layers that are still need to open. I will say, at least in my case, I will remain more focused to what happened to those communities who were left behind or who remained there. But I think Sarojani is doing more interesting work, where she's trying to find also the internal community connection, and also very fragility of another third, fourth stage of migration. So I think with the constant dialogue that I am having with Sarojani, dialogue that we three are having, are the possibility that we can have more interesting kinds of dialogue around both art and post-migration. So that will be kind of my final things. But these are the things are also unfolding many times in the neoliberal kinds of framing and new kinds of new economic policies. So there are still the things that we need to see.
Thank you. How about you, Sarojani?
So the question was, what exactly now?
Is there anything you'd like to emphasize, add to what we've discussed?
Yeah, I think, besides the issue of caste, I think that it's very interesting also to see the inter-ethnic relationship of the Indo-Caribbeans and the other ethnicities that are in Suriname at the moment. And I would say that there is a lot of ethnic tension in Suriname. And I think that this is very problematic. And I think there was a strategy of the colonizer to divide ethnicities for certain labor tasks. And I find that in the current generation, Surinamese people are ethnic division is very causes a lot of tension, as I would say. And so I think that it's very important to break through this methodology of dividing ethnicities and creating so-called multicultural society, in that we become more aware of the post-colony mentality within Caribbean awareness of this, I think, as well as in the Netherlands, where it also remains in a very different order. But we can see right now a lot of racism among ethnicities, and I think in hey, it's a bit sad. Sorry, I'm also a mom, so I cannot. I don't have a babysitter or anything, so I have to take care of my daughter. But yeah, also, this issue of tension between, I would really think that it is a healthy idea of, hey, what is it? It would be very good if we could change this mentality somehow.
Yeah.
Hey, try it. Anyway, sorry to
It's all right. It's all right. Yeah. Yeah. And then maybe as an absolute final question, maybe if you could talk about your hopes, what you hope for, and then we end on that note.
Yeah, so you are saying me, should I go?
Yeah, both of you.
Yeah, so in fact, I'm very hopeful with communities are getting more education as some kinds of new jobs, because it does not remain bracketed jobs now that you are necessarily going to work in manual labor kinds of stuff of factories and things, because these communities are also getting education, exposure, participating in university discourses, also doing very interesting artwork, more very contemporary kinds of very critical kinds of work. And that is, I think that with the kinds of new mobility, I see a lot of hope that how the way communities are moving, at least in India, and the way they are also participating in new kinds of discourses. And again, they're also doing a lot of interesting kinds of artwork, and they remain always very creative in that way. So I think creativity, art, and also that whole new kinds of generation who are developing new kinds of more complex discourses, that is site of my hope.
So on that note, I will say thank you very much, Brahma, Prakash, and also thank you, Sarojani Lewis, and this event is taking place as part of Forced Migration in the Arts, which is a an online series of conversations where we bring together academics, artists, people with lived experience of forced migration, and also activists for conversation, looking at issues similar to the ones that we've been looking at. So the next event in the series is going to be next month on the last Thursday of the month, and all are welcome to join. And once more, thank you very much, and see you next time, hopefully.
Thank you so much for giving this extending and also providing to have both of us in dialogue, me and Sarojani both as a to participate in dialogue.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.